On March 20th, 2022, I spoke with local academic, musician and artist Nastasya Yaremczuk about her personal connection to Ukraine, as well as scratched the surface of Ukraine's vast and complex history. Nastasya also unraveled a great deal of current Western extremist politics that are perpetuating a great deal of misinformation regarding the current Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Nastasya Yaremczuk.
Thank you for joining me today to celebrate Ukraine, right?
Yeah.
Because I think at the end of the day, we can talk about a lot of the problems, a lot of the abuse, a lot of the nightmares that's taking place. And, being where we're located, the best thing that we can actually do ourselves is celebrate the existence of the Ukrainian people, the existence of the culture. And, that in itself is an education for anybody who isn't already, a little bit familiar with it. So thank you for that. Why don't we start with, what is your personal connection to the Ukraine?
So I am connected to Ukraine through my father's side of the family. So my lineage goes to Bukovina, which is southwestern Ukraine. It's historically called Bukovina, but it's still kind of like, we still call it Bukovina because it's a very unique, multi-ethnic area of Ukraine that hasn't always been part of Ukraine. It's kind of gone back and forth between Romania and Ukraine a couple times. And yeah, my grandparents and my great grandparents thought of themselves as Bukovinians, partially, but this is where it gets a bit complicated. So there's a lot of layers to the ethnic identity, and then the kind of national identity, and these things kind of layer on top of each other, and they've also kind of shifted throughout history a bit. So essentially, my family would be Hutsuls who speak the Rusin language, which is considered by Ukraine to be like a dialect of Ukrainian. But it is also considered to be a separate language by some Rusins. And so Rusin is like the language family of this area of Transcarpathian Ukraine and northern Romania. And so there's three like indigenous groups or ethnic groups who have lived there for a long time, and they're the Lemkos, the Boykos, and the Hutsuls. And the Lemkos are further northwestern, kind of bordering on Poland, in the area of Galicia, what would have been historically called Galicia. And the Boykos are closer to Hungary, kind of in the center there, further to the west. And then the Hutsuls are southwest, closer to Romania, and were also located in Bukovina. Sorry, it's really complicated.
Oh, this is great.
And so, there's been, the Ukrainian national identity has been in formation for the last couple of centuries, or last few centuries. And it's kind of been, it's been a struggle for all of these indigenous groups who have lived on that land for centuries, to kind of consolidate their belonging and create a sense of unity and solidarity with each other. And that has become what Ukraine stands for and is, and that struggle is defined by all of these groups historically being a peasant class. So my ancestors were peasant farmers. And when they moved to Canada, they were still peasant farmers, and they built what they called their little Bukovina in northern Alberta. And they built, a little traditional church, like the traditional style wood Hutzol churches, which are very unique building style. So yeah, so what really unites like Ukrainians, who are a group of ethnic groups that all share a lot in common. They all, like, for the most, they've all kind of evolved along similar lines, but differences obviously exist depending on the regions where they kind of evolved throughout time. But the struggle is a struggle against imperialism, against empires, against the nobility, the upper classes, who since the Middle Ages have been basically fighting over that land. And that land being the land of Ukrainian peasants, of the peasantry, really, because it's the most arable soil or arable land in Europe. So, and historically it's been that way as well. They grow so much of the wheat and the grain for, a lot of places, not just Europe, but obviously they export to other places now. And it's another thing that defines that kind of united struggle is Ukraine as the borderland between East and West. So historically, it's basically been like a battleground for Eastern and Western empires and North and Southern empires, because the Black Sea is there and the Caucasus are there. It's a very strategic transitionary zone between East and West. And historically, it's been colonized by the Mongol Empire, by Poland, by Germany, obviously, and of course Russia most recently, for the last few centuries now. And so, yeah, I mean, really, the Ukrainian struggle is like a struggle of the proletariat. Like, it's the ultimate struggle of the proletariat. And it's been really kind of interesting to hear the Western, especially the Western leftist perspective or opinion on that, when it's generally really underinformed. People don't tend to really understand the complexity of the region and the complexity of the history there. I've noticed a tendency to really project a Western worldview onto Ukraine and onto Eastern Europe, and project our kind of Western identity politic onto that area, because we tend to think in really kind of strict lines along race, gender, all these other aspects of identity that are very real, but they're not the whole story, and they don't necessarily seamlessly apply to every situation out there. It's incredibly complicated because in places where there's historical ethnic struggles and political struggles, struggle for sovereignty, in a different context than we understand, I think, colonization here, and that we understand a simple understanding of like our place as settlers, for instance, in the West. It's like white settlers for the most part when we're talking about this kind of privileged hierarchy, right? And it's a kind of different, just a kind of completely different paradigm when we're talking about Ukraine and Eastern Europe and Russia. I mean, if we look at what's happening, Russia is a Christian nation. You know, they're, if we're thinking racially, just in terms of skin color, you know, mostly white, right? But they're enemy number one in the world right now, right? And historically, they've been like enemy number one of the West. And there's quite a few reasons for that, obviously. You know, one being, I mean, there is a history of, I mean, of the West thinking of Eastern Europeans as being Asiatic, you know, because of the Mongolian influence, because of the Middle Eastern influence, because all these different people have, you know, colonized that territory. And obviously there's been a lot of ethnic admixture and stuff. So like with, you know, Germany, in, you know, Nazi Germany, their plan was to exterminate the Slavs right after the Jews.
Yeah.
You know, because they saw Slavs, they saw, you know, Eastern Europeans as lesser, you know, dirty, you know, mixed. Yeah, exactly. And so it's like, obviously we're like in a period of transition with our kind of, you know, with like the geopolitical forces and with these like historical kind of ethnic tensions, and all, it's a clusterfuck basically. And like it's something that, like, you know, you could talk about for hours and you could study for years and years and years and years and still like really grapple to kind of put a story to it all, you know. And again, it's something that I think is really difficult for a lot of people in the West to really understand. And people, you know, have been offering their opinions without really having that knowledge base. And I mean, obviously it's everyone's right, you know, to offer their opinion, to have opinions on what's going on in the world. But, you know, there's layers, right? Like you can have an opinion on like the pure politics of it or something, as far as how much you actually understand of the politics. You know, you can have an opinion on that, but, you know, eventually you kind of hit a brick wall when you realize you're leaving out all this other context. And if that makes sense, I feel like I'm rambling a bit.
No, you're not. I think that this is really, thank you for talking about this, because, you know, like I think I mentioned separately, I by no means want to put the pressure on you to try and speak for the entirety of the Ukrainian diaspora in Victoria, but you're giving such a wonderful context for anybody who perhaps only knows a little bit about the Ukraine, only knows a little bit about the diversity that exists within the indigenous populations of the Ukraine, and, you know, the validity of how, you know, the politics, the identity politics of the West, how they don't necessarily apply to every single place outside of the West, because we've got our own thing going on here. There's a whole different thing going on over there, right?
Yeah, you can kind of argue that there's an aspect of kind of Western exceptionalism that sneaks its way into those and almost like a kind of Orientalism.
Yeah.
You know, when speaking of these other places that are I think in the Western mind so ambiguous and difficult to understand that it's easier for a lot of people to just kind of apply these a black and white narrative to it.
Yeah. No, agreed. Yeah. I'm just taking a look at your playlist songs, and I'm reading one here. And of course, you with your wonderful bilingual skills, maybe I'm putting pressure on you. Please excuse me if I am. But your bilingual skills, you went and translated "Dearest Mother of Mine" or "Song About Rushnik." Excuse me. And
yeah.
Yeah, I really appreciate what you said here, how there's a different sort of, awareness of even love songs for mothers that is a different understanding in comparison to Western culture. And
Mhm.
so, this song is something that makes a difference in that regard, or at least is an expression of that different cultural practice and different cultural appreciation, right? That
Definitely.
exists. So,
Yeah. Rida Mati Moya is the song in Ukrainian. And yeah, a song about a rushnik. So rushniki are they're basically linen um, cloths that are kind of like long cloths, and they have embroidery on each end of the cloth. And this is ancient. It's an ancient craft for women to create these ruchnik for a number of ritual purposes. They're woven into the fabric of everyday life, and each person receives a ruchnik that they're wrapped in as an infant. When they come into the world, their mother or their grandmother makes them a ruchnik, and they're wrapped in that ruchnik. And then that same ruchnik is used in their wedding ceremony, and then at the end of life, that same ruchnik is wrapped around the body for burial, or tied around the grave cross. And the embroidery is full of meaning. The symbols that are used in all vishivana, which is the embroidery of Ukraine, really, is each symbol has a lot of meaning in it. Each symbol, this meaning is ancient. Yeah, so with this song, it's basically a soldier's lament, and it's about his mother making him a ruchnik to carry with him when he goes off to fight. And obviously, there's a lot of these kind of soldiers' laments in Ukrainian musical repertoire, because again, this is just like centuries of just constant struggle, basically, against one empire or another. And yeah, like you said, the love song for mothers, like the love song for mothers, is very prominent in Ukrainian culture, and that's something we don't really have here.
yeah,
So
true.
it's an example of that. So the soldier carries that ruchnik with him, and he's saying to his mom, like, you made me a ruchnik to keep me safe. And he's saying he's laying in a field, basically, far away from home, and he's holding this ruchnik, and he's thinking of his mother.
Oh
And
God, that's making me want to cry right now. Not want to. It's like,
I know. Well, this music is so emotional and spiritual and passionate. Like, there's like a saying, a kind of proverb about Ukrainians and music, and it's that a Ukrainian is always singing. A Ukrainian sings through their sorrow, they sing through their joy, they sing through everything in life. There's a song for everything. And so music and singing is such a deeply interwoven part of like Ukrainian identity and Ukrainian culture. Some beautiful stuff.
Thank you. I just want to say, like, what you've been saying so far has been really incredible, really perfect. And I'll be honest with you. I mean, I'm gonna do a chop right here, and I am gonna play
Yeah.
that track right afterwards. I'm sure you probably picked that up, but I just thought it was such a perfect tie. And sincerely, that was making me get wet around my eyes, and I was worried that I was gonna smear my mascara. So, it's a beautiful song, and it's also heartbreaking. So thank you for this. This is exquisite.
It's sad that the West often doesn't learn about a lot of cultures until they're in a war, right?
Yeah.
That's often the thing that brings attention to, other cultures. And so it's kind of heavy, right? It's like, we're here trying to like, celebrate Ukrainian culture, but then the context of that is very tragic. And something, speaking about Ukrainian music, is there, Ukrainians don't shy away from that emotion. They don't shy away from their grief. They don't shy away from expressing that, which, with this playlist, these songs are very, very, very emotional and sad for the most part. I put a couple of fun ones just to switch it up a bit. But like, this is, it's important to acknowledge what's happening right now and not try to like sugarcoat it, right?
No.
And these songs were written for that very purpose. There's songs about grief, there's songs about war, about the pain that comes, the suffering that comes from war, the loss. And yeah, so
given all of this and given these connections, would you say that at some point or at any point, your art, your music, your academic study has been influenced by your cultural connection to the Ukraine? Has there been that natural overlap? Maybe that's a no-brainer question, because it happens, with being a part of anyone's identity, it influences it. But if you'd love to share some of that, or if you'd like to, I'd love to hear it. I'm sure everyone else would.
Definitely. Yeah. For sure. Yeah, it factors in. I mean, it's been like, how do I say this so it doesn't sound cheesy? A journey of discovery. But I mean, it has, quite honestly. Like, there's like being in the diaspora, obviously I don't have the same immediate connection to Ukraine as Ukrainians in Ukraine. It's still a distant place for me. And there's a lot of there's like a lot of different emotions there when I think about my relationship to it. And like, like I grew up knowing I was Ukrainian. I grew up, being told about my heritage, and it was like something to be proud of. And but we were also pretty disconnected from the diasporic community. Like my grandpa changed our name, from Yaremczuk to Yard, because of the kind of stigma of having a Slavic name, and that kind of pressure to just assimilate into Anglo culture, Anglo-Canadian culture. And like I don't, like I was able to talk with my grandfather, for instance, right before he died a few years ago. We were able to talk about that history and that heritage, and he was able to tell me some stories and share some beautiful photos. And but it still was very like, oh, this is just scratching the surface of what this is, of what this means, right? And so like there's like kind of a mourning of everything that's been lost through the process of immigration, right, to Canada. So much has been lost. And so for me, there's like, I feel like I'm doing the work of trying to recover a lot of that, and revitalize that in any way I can. And it's obviously a really long process, but it's like something I'm really passionate about. It really means a lot to me. Like I feel it so deeply. It's so important. It is such an important part of who I am. which is why, I'm learning the language, and also, learning to sing the songs, and why I'm in Slavic studies. I want to know the history as best as I can. Um, and why, forming and maintaining relationships and connections in the diaspora and in Ukraine is really important, especially now. It's really important to really listen to, my cousins, my brothers, and my sisters over there who are suffering and who are appealing to me as a member of the diaspora. They're saying, like, you come from here, this is your heritage too, like, please advocate for us, please, like, we need your help, um and so I feel a really strong responsibility to try to amplify their voices and really hear them, and really try to understand their experience as best as I can. And yeah, so yeah, and that you mentioned the tattoos. Yeah,
Yeah.
for a while there I was doing tattoos based on traditional Vishivanka embroidery patterns and
Oh,
symbols.
cool.
Yeah,
I
so
didn't
that's where
realize.
those come from. Yeah.
That's beautiful. Yeah, well, I think it makes sense, especially with something so personalized like tattoos that you always wear and they're close to you, they're a part of you. It has to be something that is, you know, at the end of the day, entwined with your identity in some capacity. That's
Definitely. Yeah.
that's beautiful. Yeah, everyone has their own way of connecting with themselves. It's such a weird concept when you think about, family, identity, culture. There's so many other people behind you that make you who you are. And so finding out all
Mhm.
their stories is a hard task, right? But they all inform yours over time. And that's
Definitely.
beautiful, but hard, right? It's
It
not easy.
is. It's not, yeah, but like, again, it's a process, right? And there's all these pieces to the puzzle, and it's just part of my life. It's part of the work that I will just always be pursuing, is to just gather those pieces of the puzzle and try to um make the picture a bit more whole. And like, it's really, really sad because my dad, who I actually just recently reconnected with after kind of being estranged from for a while, we've like really connected over what's happening right now and been talking about it. And we were planning a trip to Bukovina. We were planning a trip to Western Ukraine and to do like a full, tour, spend some time in Transcarpathia. And I was really like trying to get my Ukrainian, solid in time for that. And now it kind of feels like, oh God, we might not ever be able to make that trip happen.
Yeah.
It's like
Really? Yeah, exactly. What a
really, really sad. But it's like, obviously, that's like nothing compared to the fact that, what's actually happening to people who live there now. But it's just another kind of layer of that feeling of like
Mm.
loss at the hands of these imperial powers, the hands of Russian imperial, aggression and oppression. That is the very reason my family came to Canada,
Mhm.
So it's like, again, that's like a responsibility I feel to them, to really like be with it and pay attention and try to, you know, um, honor them,
Yeah.
and like honor their resilience, their strength, uh, their bravery.
What are some of the most disturbing, excuse me, what are some of the most disturbing pieces of misinformation you've come across in the last 20 plus days regarding the conflict? There's been all kinds, but like some of the
Oh
most
boy.
disturbing.
Yeah. Um, It's like a propaganda info war out there for sure. There's so many different pieces of, misinformation. I mean, obviously to start with, Putin's, big speech that he made, his pretty outlandish justifications for the invasion. Obviously, like that, his statements on, denazification, and now they're saying chemical weapons, which is really terrifying, because that is a typical false flag accusation to make. I mean, what did the United States say about Iraq, right? Before they invaded, they said they had weapons of mass destruction, and they didn't. So it's a very common false flag accusation. So that's very worrying, obviously. The denazification, oh God, this is something that I've been like seeing so much. A lot of Western leftists just, it's like they've been red pilled by, RT, Russia Today. Let's get into it.
Let's do it. Go there.
Yes, of course, there is a far right presence in Ukraine. There is a far right presence in every country in Europe, in Canada, the United States, and there's a far right presence in many other places that isn't neo-Nazis, but we have extremists of all stripes, right? And there's extremists of all stripes that are very endemic to certain locations. But in Ukraine, to really put it into context and just state the facts, the Svoboda Party, who are the far right party in Ukraine, they received less than 1.6% of the vote of Ukrainians. They did not win a single seat in parliament. If you compare that to literally every other European country, Ukraine comes out as the least far right country out of all of them. I mean, just Sweden alone, their far right party got like 25%. Around, I'm not like it was around, it was like between 20 and 25%. You'll have to verify that, but it was very high. Italy's 12%. I could go on. I mean, literally every country. It's a problem. That is a problem everywhere right now in the world. And it's something that each country needs to reckon with internally. It's their business to deal with that. And since Zelensky has been in power, and Zelensky's government, they have started, I mean, he only got elected in 2019, so he hasn't been around for long, but they've been starting to crack down on a lot of the corruption, much of which is based in the far right political movement there, which also notably, it's important to mention that a lot of that far right presence is directly from Russia. Absolutely directly from Russia. And then another thing, and also like this is part of the context, the reason for Putin's invasion right now, I think, is because Zelensky has really been trying to move Ukraine towards their Western aspirations, towards their European aspirations, has really been doing that work. Putin has gotten very scared and pissed off because he knows he no longer has a hold over Ukrainian government. He doesn't have his influence in there anymore because Zelensky basically kicked out Putin's like henchmen that were in parliament. And so he wants Zelensky out, right? And then the Azov battalion is like another thing that I just see constantly repeated over and over and over and over again by the Western left. Well, like it's almost like this justification. Well, what about the Azov battalion? So it's like, okay, so you think because there's like a couple of hundred far-right extremists that are like a volunteer battalion who are fighting on the front lines. And let's be clear too, they're not just, there's some neo-Nazi ideology in their ranks for sure, but there's a lot of other, it's basically a clusterfuck volunteer battalion of like men from all over the place, including Russia. There's even some Syrian opposition rebel fighters that have reportedly joined to get revenge on Russia for, and I'm talking about Assad opposition, Assad, right? Like Syrian fighters who opposed Assad's regime and opposed Russia's, invasion of Syria. There's a lot of these guys that are just fighting together in this battalion because it's the battalion on the front lines. And they're willing to be in the thick of the absolute worst violence. And that's not in any way, shape, or form to excuse that ideology being at all present there. It's definitely a problem. But something that, again, Western audiences have a hard time understanding is the way these ideological forces, the way these things spin, and the way they arise in a war zone, right? If we look at the Middle East, we're going to see the same thing. There's numerous extremist groups, right? And there's extremist groups that are doing absolutely horrifying things. And we don't say, oh, well, because Islamic extremism is endemic to certain areas of the Middle East that gives any justification to call them all terrorists, right? Or to, invade their sovereign nations, right? So it's important to remember, like, just because there's, and again, a couple of hundred is just like nothing. We're talking about millions and millions and millions of people in the country of Ukraine. The vast majority of whom do not support the far right. I would argue that there's way more support for the far right in the United States than there is in Ukraine. But because Ukraine's been locked in a war zone since 2014, it's been a very delicate situation to try to deal with those elements. Because obviously they're violent and they have their own interests that they're pursuing. And unfortunately, they've been useful to, the front lines. And again, I don't agree with that at all. I think it's a problem. But again, when we're talking about a war zone, it's kind of like the normal rules are hard to apply and enforce, especially given the state of Ukraine's military. They didn't even have a military when Russia invaded in 2014. They didn't have any military capabilities. They're basically sitting ducks, and there are, volunteer battalions were literally the only available defense. And they kind of made a bit of a Faustian deal right there, right?
Yeah.
But since before the invasion now, and since Zelensky's government's been in power, they were making a concerted effort to weed them out. And I have actually read some reports that I still need to verify, that the Azov battalion have been going rogue, and that the Ukrainian armed forces actually shot a missile into their headquarters.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
This isn't being covered in mainstream news, I think, because it's so controversial and because it's an area that it's such a complicated topic to get into, that I think Western media just want to kind of be hands off about that, because it's like, what do you even say about that, right? Like,
yeah, with everything else going on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, and again, like, there's the Wagner group on Russia's side, which is the Russian far right neo-Nazi battalion. They actually have way higher numbers of fighters comparatively, and they're very, very they're consolidated in with the Russian imperialist fascistic ideology that Putin is now pushing and enforcing.
Yeah.
And they have been they're guilty of unbelievably horrifying war crimes in Crimea and the Donbass since 2014. So it's like, another thing, and this is again not to in any way excuse the existence of these extremist nationalist groups, but the Ukrainian nationalism was radicalized to the far right during World War II, after the Holodomor, which was the planned and executed starvation genocide by Stalin's regime on the Ukrainian people. Millions of them died of forced starvation. I mean, the Soviet authorities were literally going door to door confiscating their food. They had food and they were having it taken from them so that they couldn't eat it, so that they would starve to death. So, this brand of extreme nationalism, it kind of arose over time after successive, repressive efforts of, the Soviet and before the Russian imperialist powers on the Ukrainian people. And again, you can see this phenomenon in any location where you have a country, a people who whose culture and very language has been banned. And they have been historically not even allowed to practice or speak their own language, practice their own culture, or have their own sovereignty. And these hyper forms of nationalism arise in all those instances, and it's something we have to reckon with. It's something we have to try to understand from another perspective outside of like our own kind of insulated Western worldview.
Yeah.
And it's another thing too, is like, I think for Western audiences, like, we think anything evil, like the most evil thing in the world are Nazis, right? Neo-Nazis. And yeah, they're like fucking evil. And I wish they didn't exist and they need to be kicked off the face of the earth. But they don't have a monopoly on evil anymore. Like, newsflash, I hate to break it to people, right? They don't have a monopoly on evil anymore. There is so much hatred and evil in the world, and unfortunately, a lot of this hate is a direct result of other oppressive forces persistently, encroaching onto, other peoples and onto their land, onto their very existence, right? It's a really tragic reality. And I really hope that this war doesn't embolden those elements that are present. I hope that the Ukrainian armed forces continues to you know,
Eradicate
eradicate them.
the Nazi issue, which there really
Yeah,
isn't one. I
yeah,
don't know. Maybe I'm making a broad brush stroke here, but I feel like that's a leftist way of splitting hairs about something that's not really clear to everybody. And with your stats, it's like, we even had more people vote for the People's Party of Canada this, in the last election, right? And Maxime Bernier is bonkers. So
exactly. Look at your own backyard, right? Look at your own
yeah,
backyard. Would you argue, right? Would you make the argument that Canada has the right to be, I don't know, invaded by the United States,
because we have
because
Maxime
there's
Bernier.
exactly, like it's a really ridiculous argument when you just examine it for a couple of minutes, right? And just think, okay, well, let's again, like, sorry, I need to take a sip of water.
Oh yeah, take a swiggy. But yeah, it's such a weird thing to argue when you see civilians' houses being blown up, fitness facilities, schools, maternity wards, cancer clinics, cars being blown up, and you're like, don't they have a Nazi problem? Doesn't that mean that we should be dealing with their Nazi problem?
Exactly.
Like, really?
No, well, it's really disturbing because again, it's just taken so out of context. And I've read a lot of scholarship on the issue by scholars of genocide and Holocaust scholars, and unanimously, again and again, the scholarship says that the far right element in Ukraine is just highly exaggerated in terms of the actual influence it holds. So yeah, we need to look at our own backyards and realize, like, and I can't help but wonder, like, is there an element of like the willingness, and not just willingness, like almost like a giddiness on the part of a lot of, maybe not giddiness, but a disturbing amount of enthusiasm on the part of a lot of Western leftists, unfortunately, specifically those we call the tankies, who are basically Soviet apologists, who have a very kind of rosy, idealistic view of what the Soviet Empire was, or what they thought it was, and they, whether they realize it or not, they are in fact celebrating ethnic cleansing and genocide of Ukrainians. They're celebrating cultural genocide, and there's absolutely no reason for that. And it makes me really wonder, where is that coming from? Is there some prejudice present in those viewpoints that they aren't even aware of? And like, it's like, okay, there's a couple of neo-Nazi gangs in Ukraine. They're everywhere. Is it, why is it okay in the West? Why aren't you constantly talking about that, right? Like, I mean, people do, but like, why is it a justification for an entire people to be a nation of 40 million people, none of whom voted for these, neo-Nazis? How is that a justification to bomb them to hell, right? And yeah, like you were saying, Russia fights really, really dirty. It's something that Syrians, I've read a lot of articles, open letters from Syrians who survived Russia's assault, Russia and Assad's assault, and they basically have like penned these letters to Ukrainians saying, like, be careful, look out, because Russia fights dirty. Like they will bomb your hospitals, they will target your children, and that's exactly what they're doing in Ukraine. They're doing the exact same thing they did to Syrians. And I mean, just the other day, there is a theater that thousands of Ukrainians were sheltering and hiding in.
Blowing up.
And they wrote in front of the theater on the ground, Deity, which is children, means children. They wrote that in huge white chalk letters so that you could see it from an aerial view from the sky. And they specifically targeted, dropped a bomb.
Wow.
You
of course
know,
they did. Of course they did.
Exactly. So, you know, like, and it's disturbing that I'm not seeing from these people who are making these kinds of arguments, if you could call it that. I'm not seeing any compassion or any outrage at all over what Russia's doing. It's like they're either just completely indifferent or they just don't mind at all that it's happening. And yeah, it's like I've seen like almost like this active effort to try to discredit Ukraine, to try to discredit Ukrainians in any way, shape, or form that they can. And just been kind of like asking myself, trying to find out where this is coming from, right? And so much of it is just coming directly from Russia. It's just straight up Russian propaganda.
Yeah, it is. I think I mentioned on the show in the past because it was just like, it was so surreal, and I'll keep my business to a minimum here, but I saw a clip somewhere on YouTube of like Russian state media, and it was bizarre. It was literally like some kind of weird drug trip, but like a really disappointing one. That the whole weird arguments that they had about totally nonsensical stuff, Putin coming out and waving, people in costumes singing all those hideous songs.
The big rally.
Yeah, it was like, what is going on here? And it's just so bizarre, and it's so removed from reality. And that is the state TV, and that's what is getting spoon-fed to people, and that's where these weird forms of rhetoric are coming from.
Precisely.
Yeah, it's because it has to come from somewhere. It doesn't develop in a vacuum. It's being manufactured, and then people are accessing it, and they don't know any.
And they have the Z now, right?
Yeah, what does that mean?
Well, it's basically their swastika. I mean, like, come on, like that rally was. I don't like to compare every horrible, evil thing to Hitler, because it's like, okay, again, like a lot of other forms of evil out there, right? But there it was very similar to, you know, Hitler's rallies, right? Just like massive group of, I think there was 200,000 people at that rally, and cheering on this war. And you know, another piece of maybe not misinformation, but I think like a kind of ambiguous topic here is the position of Russians, right, in Russia. And there's a lot of people arguing, right, that most Russians don't want the war. You know, they're just spoon-fed, you know, propaganda, state TV propaganda, and they don't know any better. To a certain extent, that's true. But, you know, at what point do you acknowledge that the majority of Russians in recent polls that have been, you know, done by independent organizations, right, who aren't like Russian state television or Russian state media, these polls that have been taken shown upwards of over 60% of Russians support the special operation. And you know, some major Russian universities have penned open letters in full support of the war.
Wow.
And there's a lot of staunchly racist, anti-Ukrainian messaging. They're called, they're on state TV, they're saying things like, they're dirty dogs, they deserve to be put down. It's really, the rhetoric is getting more and more disturbing every day. And yes, it's propaganda, and propaganda is really powerful. But there's a lot of Russians who have had full access to the internet, to, everything, to all the other information out there. And in some, areas, there's been an active willingness to choose their narrative. And, that narrative choice is the, patriotic, nationalistic, pride, right, in the great Russia, the great imperial Russia, and this belief that has, been a foundation of, Russian nationalism, Russian patriotism for hundreds of years, and that's the belief that they are ethnically superior to all of the other European people, Eastern European people surrounding them. So, Belarusians, Ukrainians, Ukrainians are the little Russians. They're not their own people. Belarusians are the white Russians, just like, they're all just different varieties of Russian. Then of course there's, Central Asian countries, Georgia, Kazakhstan, all these places, right, where Russia is doing the same thing, right, enforcing their Russian ethnic superiority, which is exactly what Stalin did. He wrote extensively on Russian exceptionalism, Russian ethnic exceptionalism, and wrote extensively of how all these other people were below them and needed to be kept in their place and not allowed to be sovereign, not allowed to, so there's a long history to that rhetoric. And yeah, at what point do you say, okay, there's some responsibility that some people have, especially when you see that there are people speaking out, there are Russians who are speaking out and who are protesting this.
And there's ones that choose to follow it. It's like no different than any right and left in a country, right? Obviously it can get more extreme, and that's beginning to sound more like, Second World War era Germany, right? With the rhetoric being fed to people that they are gladly eating,
Precisely.
At the end of that war, people said that they didn't know when they did at the time, right?
Yeah, but we've still held them responsible, right? They've still been held responsible, and they've been, since then, as a country, they've been, repenting, basically, right? They've been.
But there's no chastising going on right now. Russia's being enabled. There's nothing being done.
Precisely, yeah. Unfortunately, the number of people that are speaking out are in the minority. And that's really disturbing,
I feel like there's another track here that definitely connects. It's the Cossack Lament by Julian. Once again, I'm ruining all this exquisite language with terrible pronunciation.
Kytasty. Yeah,
that's great. I love saying that, Kytasty. Your description here really just, I feel like, connects, talking about a little bit about how there was the experience of the Soviet era, and how that just it's not all that it was wrapped up to be, folks. It wasn't, a golden time. The proletariat didn't have it that great.
No, they didn't have it great at all. There's a kind of there's been a long Ukrainian anarchist movement, since before the Bolsheviks went into Ukraine and imposed Soviet empire, Soviet ideology there. The Ukrainian independence movement prior to the Soviet Union, there was a lot of anarchistic elements in there, and they saw the Soviets as the bourgeoisie, because the Ukrainians, they were the peasants. They were the ones producing, the food for, for the empire and for the Russian Empire and then for the Soviet Empire. And they saw, the Russian Soviets and imperialists as the bourgeoisie. They were the upper class. They were like the nobility coming in and telling them what to do.
Mm-hmm.
So, the fight for Ukrainian independence is a fight of the proletariat, like from the ground up. Like that's like the bottom of the ladder there. We're talking about a peasant class, right? And, it's not just ethnic Ukrainians that fought the Soviets and that resisted the Soviets. Like basically every single ethnic group, including Jews, including the Crimean Tatars, all resisted the Soviets together. And so, we in the West, we just don't know what it was like to live under the Soviet regime in one of, these smaller Soviet outposts, right? Sure, maybe if you were Russian and you were, in a better position financially, because there was a hierarchy, there was a shit ton of corruption. There wasn't just perfect equality everywhere, right? But if you were Russian, you got to have those higher positions, those better paid positions. You had access to a better opportunities. But if you were anyone else, you didn't. Like even, Ukrainian language was outlawed. Like you weren't allowed to speak it in, any of the Soviet administrative centers. The intelligentsia weren't allowed to speak it. Like if you were among the intellectual class, the artist class, writers, you weren't allowed to speak it. You weren't allowed to write in Ukrainian. I mean, if you published, a newsletter or a poem in Ukrainian, you were gonna either get sent to the gulag or just executed. So like it's pretty extreme. It's just, these are like, the reality of what the Soviet Union was for these people is just a completely different reality than it may have been for some, much more privileged, ethnic Russians living in Russia under the Soviet Empire. I'm worried about like overstepping my, bounds here. Like I don't want to speak for Ukraine or Ukrainians, but my information comes directly from scholarship first of all. So speaking of reliable information, I mean, again, we're in an info war. There's a lot of competing propaganda, a lot of competing narratives out there, and I just don't really believe in completely unbiased journalism, for instance. Even, there's bias that, finds its way into scholarship as well. Like it's hard to find a complete neutrality, right? And so what I do is I try to info gather and cross reference and cross check and try to verify any way I can all the information that I'm coming across. And it's it's like a lot of combing through history, obviously, and combing through scholarship from various sources and various perspectives and trying to find the bits of truth that are repeated in all those different places, right? So it's like, okay, let's fact gather as much as possible and then kind of build a framework with those facts, and then from there let's add in like the personal narratives of Ukrainians, which is my number one source of just real-time information about the war. It's what people I know and I've connected with, what they're telling me, and what I'm hearing from these first-hand accounts, right? That's like the number one, that's like where I'm like centering, my info gathering or whatever. And then I'm just trying to fill in the gaps with the history and with, the politics of it all as best as I can. So I don't have, like, I can't really list, I didn't prepare this, I didn't list all of the different groups that I do follow. I have one group that is really great in Canada and the diaspora is the Ukrainian anti-racist community. They're a group in northern Alberta who've been putting out a lot of good information, and they have a very responsible perspective. They're coming from a very responsible standpoint in terms of checking their own biases as much as possible, I think, and clarifying a lot of misinformation that's coming out, and providing the counter narrative, the experience of actual Ukrainians, to say, well, it's one thing to have your debates as Westerners about the politics, but this is what's actually happening to people. This is what's actually happening to people. This is what's actually happened to people for the last 100 years, for instance. This is the continuity of that. It's the continuity of oppressive violence from Russia on Ukraine, the Ukrainian people, and it's still happening to them. And that is how they see it. That is how they feel, right? Is that they, since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, and since, Ukrainian independence, they've been fighting, tooth and nail to maintain that, right? Against the incredible odds of the world's second largest nuclear power being right next door and telling them, you're not allowed to do this and you're not allowed to do that. I mean, essentially, you're still not allowed to be a sovereign nation, even though, that was the guarantee you were given. I mean, the fall of the Soviet Union, Ukraine was, forced to give up to surrender, or, compelled to surrender. They agreed to this deal to surrender their nuclear arsenal to Russia with the guarantee that Russia would never invade.
Damn.
It was a really dirty move, right? Like, that's a really dirty move. Like, surrender your nuclear weapons. We promise we won't hurt you. We won't invade. We won't ever question your independence or whatever. And it's not that it's 20 years later. That's not a long time.
No.
And, if you look at just the history of those 20 years, you can see all these events of like Russia Russia had to go through a period of recovery themselves, right? So they weren't really messing with Ukraine for that period of their own economic recovery and consolidation and building their power structures back up and whatnot. But since they've accomplished that, you can see this very clear line, basically, is since they've accomplished that, economic stability, and Putin's been in power, he's become more and more emboldened. And he's, become more and more obsessed with this, Russian imperial nostalgia, right? And this regret that Ukraine is no longer part of the Russian Empire. I mean, he literally said it in his, speech, his declaration of, the night of the invasion.
Yeah.
So
he wants that. He wants to claim a lot more of Eastern Europe and say it's just all Russia. And Ukraine is a beautiful, point to just plow right through and then just start taking Lithuania, take Poland, take everybody. Just
yeah, I don't know if he's stupid enough to actually try to invade a NATO country. I mean, it's easy for him to invade Ukraine because they're just not a NATO member.
Yeah.
And I mean, it was a completely false flag. It was a complete bluff to say that, and this is another thing that I've seen Western, tanky leftists repeating over and over again. Well, the West, NATO promised that they wouldn't expand eastward. They promised Russia, and Russia has legitimate security concerns with NATO, on their doorstep if NATO, expands into Ukraine. First of all, NATO has made it really abundantly clear that Ukraine is not on the list for NATO membership. Like, they're so far from it.
Yeah.
And, second of all, what are these, post-Soviet states supposed to do? They don't have these like massive militaries. They don't have like nuclear arsenal. They live in the shadow of a nuclear monster who historically has oppressed them and, done horrible things to them that they, fought to be free of that yoke, right? And the only other offer on the table, it was the West offering them, okay, well, do you want NATO membership? Like, they asked for it, rather. It's like, can we have it? Because we have no other we have no other security measures. We have no other security guarantees here. We're vulnerable, right?
Yeah.
Right next door to Russia. So, but even still, Ukraine has offered, in the peace talks recently, to remain a neutral state, to not join NATO, which is just like, they've been forced into that position at gunpoint, right? And Zelensky himself has said, like, how can you he was asked, like, how can you trust Putin, saying, if Putin says that, they'll leave you alone if you don't join NATO, if you remain a neutral state, how can you trust Putin? Zelensky said, well, I can't, obviously, but I don't have any other choice.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's where we're at. But even with that offer, Russia still isn't backing down. So it's obvious that that is not the reason that they have invaded, because if that was the reason that they had invaded, then they would be satisfied with Ukraine's offer to remain a neutral state, and they're not. They're still bombing hospitals. And so there you have it, right? My favorite thing about Ukrainian culture, I mean, it's just like all very beautiful to me. And the music is like always the first thing on my list. It's my favorite thing to listen to. And I would say that, like, the essence of Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian identity is in the songs, is in the music, because, and speaking of folklore, I mean, the folklore is in the songs as well. Basically the whole story, the whole story of like Ukrainian history and Ukrainian identity is in their songs. So yeah,
it's beautiful.
And some of those songs are on this playlist.
Sweet.
That I selected. They're some of my favorites.
Awesome. I also can't help but, think about the parallel. Obviously, it's like a different thing entirely, and I'm not trying to make a cultural connection because that's just like inappropriate, but I think it's quite endearing because in my mind, I often think of you and your music. So like the first thing comes to mind, I think of you, I think of music, and I think the music you make. And so, regardless of what is the source of your inspiration for your music, I think it's cool that music is like a creative expression in that sense, and it's like an extension of you and your person, right? And so it's cool.
And you find like you discover there's like all those, like, even like I realized, like, even just like the style of singing, that I have just always that comes naturally to me, is that I inherit from that the Ukrainian side of my family. It's a very specific kind of vibrato and a specific kind of melodic quality and emotive quality that the more I listen to Ukrainian music and traditional songs, the more I'm hearing that and like, oh, wow, that's where it comes from. Like, it comes straight from that place, right? So it's really cool to like make those connections. And yeah,
it's beautiful. Yeah, you never know what what makes you do the things you do until, maybe there's a parallel with distant family connections, and all this stuff you find when you explore. I think that's beautiful. Sweet.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you. Oh my God. Thank you for everything. Thank you for this interview. Thank you for this playlist. This is gorgeous. It's been wonderful chatting with you.
You too.
Thank you for chatting with me, Nastasya, and sharing with such great care the contextual aspects of Ukrainian heritage through a Diaspora lens, clarifying false accusations and celebrating Ukraine with your exquisite playlist for today's show.